Hello, everyone. Welcome to Air Masses and Characteristics. At the end of this presentation, students will be able to identify what air masses are, the type of air masses, and their characteristics. What is an air mass? Well, an air mass is a large body of air that has similar temperature and humidity, and these air masses are formed over regions across the globe. These regions are going to be really important later, so please keep them in mind. Types of air masses. The type of air mass depends on two factors. We're going to focus on the first factor, which is where these air masses are formed. The question being, is that air mass formed over land or is it formed over water? First, let's look what happens when it's formed over land. When an air mass is formed over land, we call it a continental air mass. Continental air masses are much drier and carry less humidity because they are formed over land. On the other side, we have air masses that are formed over water. These are our maritime air masses. Maritime air masses have higher humidity because they have more access to water. These are the first two classifications that we are going to use to categorize our air masses. Let's take a look at this map. So, looking at the map, we're going to start in the very top at the northern tip of the continent. At the very top, I have circled a continental air mass in the northern US and southern Canada. This mass was formed over land, meaning it's going to have less moisture and less humidity. Now, there's a second continental air mass on this map and is over the state of Texas. This is also a continental air mass, so it is still going to have low humidity and low moisture. These are the two continental air masses that are on this map, both of which have the same characteristics of being dry. Now, let's take a look at the maritime air masses. So let's take a look at the northeast, where we see our first maritime air mass. This air mass was formed in the waters north of the US and Canada and is making its way south towards the equator. This air mass is going to be high in humidity and high in moisture because of its access to this water. Now, there's a second maritime air mass in the south, closer to Florida. This air mass is also formed over water, so it is going to have lots of humidity and moisture. Okay, so on slide 3, I mentioned that there were two factors that impacted the categorization or the type of air masses. The first being where it was formed, whether it was formed on land or whether it was formed on water. The second is going to be how far was this air mass formed from the equator. The further from the equator, the cooler the temperatures are going to be. The closer to the equator, the warmer the temperatures are going to be. So when we look at air masses that were formed far from the equator, we classify them as polar air masses. These are air masses with colder temperatures, making their air have a higher density. On the other side, air masses that are formed closer to the equator are going to be our tropical air masses. These are going to have a higher temperature and a lower density. These are the two categories that we use to categorize our air masses. So now, let's combine the terrain and the location to get the full name of our air masses. So all air masses fit into four categories, four main types. The first being continental polar. Continental polar air masses are formed over land. We know that because it's continental, and they're formed far from the equator. We know that because it's noted as polar. Because of this, these air masses are going to be dry and cold. They're noted by a lowercase c and a capital P. Our second type of continental air mass is going to be our continental tropical. Continental tropical are air masses formed over land. Once again, it's continental, so it's over land. And now it is closer to the equator, so it's noted as tropical. So these air masses are going to be described as dry and hot. These air masses are noted with lowercase c's and uppercase t's. So those are the two different classifications of continental air masses. Let's take a look at the two classifications for maritime air masses. The first maritime air mass that we are going to look at is maritime polar. Maritime implies that the air mass was formed over water. Polar tells us that it was formed far from the equator. So maritime polar air masses are going to be described as being high humidity and high moisture, and polar would imply that they are going to be cold because they're far from the equator. These are noted with a lowercase m and a capital P. The last of our maritime air masses and the last classification of all of our air masses is maritime tropical. Maritime tropical is formed over water, meaning it is going to have high humidity, high moisture, and it is formed close to the equator, so it's going to be warm. So we would describe maritime tropical air masses as high humidity and high temperature. These are noted by a lowercase m and a capital T. So now, let's take a look back at the map that we were looking at before. Here's the map that we were looking back at slide 4. Notice that I've taken away the covering so you can see the full labeling of the air masses on the map. The first air mass we're going to take a look at is the continental polar air mass in the northern part of this map. Because this air mass is far from the equator, it is polar. Because it's formed over land, it is continental. So the characteristics of this air mass would be dry and cold. So now the second continental air mass is near the state of Texas. This is much more south, which means it's much closer to the equator, so it is going to be warmer. It's still continental, so it's still going to be dry, but because it is closer to the equator, it is going to be warmer. Let's take a look at the maritime air masses on this map as well. So in the northeast, we have the maritime polar air mass. This air mass was formed over water, so it's going to have high humidity and high moisture. And it is far from the equator, so it is going to be polar, meaning that it's going to be cold. Whereas our second maritime air mass is in the south, closer to the state of Florida. It's still maritime, so it's still going to have high humidity and high moisture, but it is tropical. It's closer to the equator, so that temperature is going to be much higher than its northern counterpart. Okay. Thank you for listening. Next time, we will take a look at what happens when these air masses collide and see what types of weather these areas should be expecting when one of these air masses moves into their area. Have a great week.